This is a bonus episode of History as It Happens. It's December 3rd, 2025. Almost another full year has come and gone, and the war in eastern Ukraine grinds on, far longer than the 24 hours President Donald Trump said it would take to settle it.
Mr. President, Johannes Petra from Austrian National Television.
How are you?
You once said that you would end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. You later said that sarcastically.
Well, of course it was sarcastic.
But you've now been in office for 5 months and 5 days. Why have you not been able to end the Ukraine war?
Because it's more difficult than people would have any idea. Vladimir Putin has been more difficult. Frankly, I had some problems with Zelensky. You may have read about him.
Everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
In those early days of 2025, the American president took Putin's side, saying Ukraine was at fault for starting the war. Then he seemed to lose interest for a while, and then there was a summit in Alaska that accomplished very little. And most recently, this week, U.S. envoys met Russian officials at the Kremlin. A 5-hour session produced no breakthroughs on a revised plan whose original version was heavily tilted toward Russian interests.
You spoke with Mr. Witkoff and with Mr. Kushner
Last night.
Did they give you the sense that President Putin still wants to end the war, wants to make peace?
He would like to end the war. That was their impression. Now, whether or not,
do you believe him?
That was their impression. Their impression was that he would like to see the war ended. I think he'd like to get back to dealing a more normal life. I think he'd like to be trading with the United States of America, frankly, instead of, losing thousands of soldiers a week.
So the war continues.
The Russian drones attacked before dawn.
What will it take to end the war, which is not the same as saying achieving peace? Yaroslav Trofimov is the chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and the author of 2 books related to this conflict, Our Enemies Will Vanish and No Country for Love. Yaroslav Trofimov, welcome back.
Great to be back.
This year began with the Trump administration saying that peace would be easy. He would end the war. President Trump would end the war in 24 hours. I think everyone understood that would not happen. There was that infamous meeting in the Oval Office with Trump deriding, or I should say berating, President Zelensky. There was a summit at some point this year in Alaska that had no discernible results, and now this most recent round of negotiations. Before we get into any specifics, how would you generally assess the state of play in negotiations in the war right now?
You know what? It really is Groundhog Day. We have these cycles of hopes, and at the end of the day, it turns out to be much ado about nothing. And we're back to square one. And there have been many of these by now, starting with February. And obviously, you had Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy, going to Moscow, coming back starry-eyed, announcing that President Putin is ready to do this and that. And then they would go to the nitty-gritty and force the hand of the Ukrainians and force the Ukrainians to accept a lot of the concessions, and then we'll go back to Putin, and Putin would say, well, actually, I want more. Actually, that's not good enough. And actually, there's no deal. What Putin is achieving through all of this is very real material benefits. I mean, this latest round did not lead to any breakthrough in peace, but it did lead to the U.S. dropping talk of supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, which used to be on the table, no longer are, and is derailing efforts by the Europeans to use the $300 billion in Russian money that's frozen, mostly in Belgium, to help the Ukrainians fight the war. And, you have these new divisions in the West. So this game is being played really skillfully by Russia.
Who wrote the 28-point proposal? There was a dispute over this in the United States. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, apparently, and I have to say apparently because it's not clear, saying it was a Russian plan. No, then the U.S. had written it. What's your best information on that?
This plan came out of meetings that Steve Witkoff had with the Russian special envoy, Kirill Dmitriev. And obviously, Jared Kushner also started playing a role in this. And the plan reflects, a lot of the core demands that Russia has had since this whole thing began with the first round of talks in February 2022, when Russian tanks were on the outskirts of Kiev. And the key demands were handover of the territories, recognition of Russian occupation of these territories, limits on the Ukrainian ability to defend itself, and a ban on any foreign alliances or any presence of foreign troops or any meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine. Because what Russia seeks is a Ukraine that is disarmed, a Ukraine that is not in a position to defend itself the next time the Russians invade. And that is still the goal. That is why President Putin did not agree even to this latest iteration of the plan once those key parts of the plan were removed.
Yeah, the plan has been revised since it was initially proposed, although, as you say, some of these points or stipulations were not new. They've been there since the beginning. Before we get to the Russian side, one more question about what's happening on the American side. Of course, there's also the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians weren't present for the initial plan rollout. But why is it that Kushner and Witkoff and not the Secretary of State are leading the U.S. negotiations?
Well, it's a good question. And obviously, the Europeans are asking that question as well. I mean, Witkoff is a cabinet level appointee now. So he has a formal role in the US government, unlike Jared Kushner. But if you look at a lot of these deals, you have this billionaire diplomacy. So you have President Trump working with very rich people whom he trusts, perhaps because they're rich, who very often overrides formal policy. Look at the example of Syria. There was a lot of people who were opposed to the recognition of the new government there, to lifting the sanctions on Ahmed al-Shara's government in Syria that does have a lot of Islamists with bad past, including himself, who used to be in ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That was all overruled because Tom Barrack, the very rich, now U.S. ambassador to Syria and special envoy for Syria, had different opinions. And so you have the formal U.S. government in Washington, and then you have the other government of President Trump and his billionaire friends meeting in Miami or in Mar-a-Lago in Florida, who perhaps sometimes have more authority than the formal government. And so you have situations in which Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is also the national security advisor, two of the most important national security jobs in the country, finds out about this major breakthrough once it leaked out to the media, as far as we can know.
Yeah, your newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, reported a headline, "Make Money, Not War. Trump's Real Plan for Peace in Ukraine. The Kremlin pitched the White House on peace through business. To Europe's dismay, the president and his envoy are on board." The implication of the story is that there's corruption involved here to benefit Trump personally.
Well, we don't say in the story that there is corruption to benefit Trump personally, but certainly, the Russian government is dangling out a lot of carrots to a lot of people, offering them personally beneficial deals in exchange for basically getting Ukraine. But, the whole idea, if you listen to Steve Witkoff himself, he has much nobler terms. And, he says, well, there is just giant business opportunities and we'll bring peace through business and everybody's going to get rich. Well, you know what? Angela Merkel had the same idea. She had this famous, Wandel durch Handel, cooperation through trade. And that's why she built the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to pipe Russian gas into Germany and Europe. And what actually happened is that this whole trade just funded the Russian war machine and enabled the invasion, enabled the Russian imperialism. So that approach with Russia has been tried already. That's why we have the war in Ukraine now.
Is it possible that Putin is looking for a way out of this? He keeps saying we're winning, keeps pushing these maximalist demands. And I know my question might sound silly because I really don't think the man is interested in peace per se. But is it possible that he understands the reality that trying to militarily conquer Ukraine might be impossible for him and that he's not going to get much more than he already has? So he's seeking to get more through negotiations, and he would also benefit from a pause in hostilities.
I think he still wants all of Ukraine. I think he doesn't believe that conquering all of Ukraine is impossible. He might want a pause in hostilities. And, if this is a pause in which he gets to rearm, to, replenish his coffers, and the sanctions are lifted, and the cohesion of the West is destroyed. Meanwhile, Ukraine is not allowed to rearm, and Ukraine collapses into internal bickering and squabbling and political crisis. Then in a year or two, he can attack again and get to Kiev. it would be the third invasion, right? Because they already did it in 2014, imposed the deal on Ukraine, which they violated. In 2014, they violated the commitments in the Budapest Memorandum of
To listen to this entire episode, tap subscribe now in the show notes or go to historyasithappens.supercast.com. For $5 a month, you'll get all bonus content, ad-free listening to every episode, and access to the entire catalog of 500 episodes since 2021. historyasithappens.supercast.com.